So, welcome comrades, well done for attending. I know everything's been against people actually getting to the hall today, but it's great to see so many bums in seats and so many people coming out, because our regular seminars are well worth attending and they're fantastic resources. It's great that we get them out online, but it's good to see you in person comrades, because we can have so much more discussion, debate, meet each other, talk about practical activities as well. So well done, and thank you all of you for making it down here today. I know the weather and our public transport systems haven't made it easy, so congratulations on getting here. So today we're going to be talking a bit about the fall of Syria, and really with a focus on the complicity stemming from failure to complicity of the anti-war movement, or the so-called anti-war movement in imperialist countries, and how they have failed to stop any single imperialist war in the entire history of the anti-war movement, and what lessons we can draw from that, what messages we need to take to workers, how can we understand that our anti-war movement isn't an anti-war movement, and what we need to do to change that. And Comrade Alex is going to be talking a little bit about why the imperialists wanted to destroy Syria, why they wanted to invade Syria. And I mean, it's the same story with every target for imperialist aggression, really, but with the specifics on Syria. And I'll talk a little bit about my experiences in the anti-war movement and the propaganda, and what we've experienced over the past decade in our, or more than a decade, in our Syria solidarity work that the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist, has been doing. But first, I just want to take a moment of your time to announce, I'm sure comrades here will have heard, and maybe you watching at home as well, the passing of our founding chairman and dear comrade, friend and teacher, Harpal Brar, who died this morning, surrounded by friends and family at home. Harpal was an immigrant to Britain in the 1960s. He came from Punjab in India to study law here. And it was here he began studying Marxism-Leninism as well, and got involved in politics. So he was a law student here, and he got involved with various anti-revisionist groups. And since the 1960s, he has been continuously, ceaselessly politically active right up until these past few weeks. He was attending our meetings, party meetings, even a couple of weeks ago after recovering from a bout of illness. He has 4 articles in the most recent Laukar journal that's coming out soon, and helped edit all of the content in that as well. So he was a ceaseless, dedicated servant to the working class, and he was a humble person despite his weighty and massive contributions. And I mean, you just need to go look at the books published by Harpal and his comrades over the past few decades, and that really started with perestroika. I mean, they were working actively politically, publishing journals and collections of written work, but Harpal's work really began in earnest after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And at the time it was most difficult to be a communist, at the time it was most difficult to be an anti-revisionist Marxist-Leninist, Harpal stepped up his activity. They formed the Stalin Society, began publishing works like Perestroika to explain that it was not a failure of Marxism-Leninism, it was not a failure of communism, as all the revisionist parties were folding themselves, collapsing, as all the Trotskyist parties were celebrating the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. Harpal was diligently working with comrades to explain that it was just the opposite. It was revisionism that had collapsed, it was revisionism that had failed, it was revisionism that had poisoned the movement. Revisionism, Trotskyism, opportunism, all these things are so important for us to understand and guard against. And it was with those comrades that he spent the next 30 years working hard in the Stalin Society, and founded our party just over 20 years ago with just a small handful of comrades. But never relenting, never losing hope, always persisting. And he was a very patient teacher as well. He would come to anyone that wanted to ask him a question about Marxism-Leninism, anyone that wanted to know more, he always had time for people to, it didn't matter who they were, what their background was, if they wanted to ask Harpal a question or discuss politics with them, he always made time, he always found time. That was his prime joy in life, was trying to educate people in Marxism-Leninism, discussing and debating Marxism-Leninism. But he never shied away from getting to the truth of the matter. He never put personal relationships or keeping the peace or any other kind of liberal notions, he never put those in the way of the core aim, which is the emancipation of the working classes of the world, the emancipation of the working class in Britain through the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist. So it's up to all of us to learn from his example. It's up to all of us to live up to his example in the work that we do every day. And Harpal would always say, when you put your head on the pillow, when you wake up in the morning with your head on the pillow, think about what you can do for the party that day. And when you go to bed at night and rest your head on the pillow, think about what you've done for the party that day. And if it's nothing, ask yourself why. What have you been doing for the working class? What have you done today? Even if it's just a small thing, even if it's just one thing. Because every small step, every small action brings us closer. And I think Harpal would be, I know Harpal was very proud of where our party is today. As we go into 2025, our party is stronger than ever before. It has more dedicated and sincere comrades than ever before. And our movement is growing. And I'm sure by following Harpal's example, we can achieve victory. So I'm sure I'd say stop waffling and get on with the meeting. We've got business to attend to. So we're here to talk about Syria and what for many people was a sudden, shocking and very disheartening and dismaying collapse of the Syrian government, the Ba'athist party in Syria, the Syrian army, in the wake of a quite surprising rush of terrorists in the form of HTS from the north, who moved swiftly, but most importantly were not countered by the army. And you know, that was very difficult for a lot of people to see, communists, peace activists, anti-imperialists, who had been doing our best for the past 13, 14 years to counter the mainstream narrative, counter the mainstream propaganda that Syria was run by a bloodthirsty tyrant with an iron grip on the country, and explain to people, no, there's a reason that our government and our media are telling you to hate the Syrian government, to support military action against the Syrian government, to cheer the rebels against the Syrian government. And within the anti-war and communist, socialist, leftist movements, a variety of tendencies and trends and people calling for support for a wide variety of groups, whether that was the Kurds in the northeast of Syria or disparate groups of imaginary workers' councils throughout Syria, you know, trying to say that, no, it will be a good thing when the Syrian state is destroyed. Like they told us before Libya as well, it will be a good thing when Gaddafi is gone and the Jamahiriya is no longer in charge of Libya. And we all know how that turned out. So it's important for us to understand what happened in the context of Syria and why it happened. But we're also going to talk a lot about who is to blame for it. And it's not a question of, could Assad have done things differently? Should Assad have done this or that? Should the Russians have done this or that? Should Iran have done this or that? We're in Britain. We're not in the Iranian government or military. We're not in the Russian government or military. It's not our job to sit on the sidelines and cheerlead and spectate these things. It's our job in Britain to foster an anti-war movement that understands that is our government perpetrating crimes, heinous crimes, worse than they accuse, or as bad as they accuse all of these other governments of doing. Our government is committing these crimes against populations across the world. And I think people have been waking up to that, especially with the Palestine demonstrations over the past year and almost a half now. And we have to pause to congratulate the Palestinian people on their victory. On their victory, not ceasefire. The Palestinians have endured over a year, 1 year and 4 months of brutal genocide, and it's not war. It's not two armies slogging out on the battlefield. It's Israel demolishing cities. It's Israel bombing hospitals. It's cutting off aid. And it didn't start on October the 7th. It's been going on for decades, and it's just the latest phase in that struggle for Palestinian independence. And it was a victory that they've managed to achieve a ceasefire in Lebanon, in Palestine, because that means the Israelis have not achieved the objective they wanted, which is to expand Israel, to cleanse the Gaza Strip, to conquer southern Lebanon. They have not achieved that. And you can see that if you look at the face of the people celebrating on the streets of Gaza, and rightly so, as the aid trucks are let back in and the bombs almost stop. They were celebrating. And if you look at the faces of people in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, the Israelis, the Zionists, were not celebrating. They were shook to their core that the war had stopped and they had not won. I can't remember who the quote is from, but someone brought it up recently that the point of an army or a state in war is to win, to achieve its goals. The point of guerrillas is to survive and to continue existing. And Palestine will survive. Palestine will continue existing. But the Syrian state had a huge amount of support for the Palestinian people throughout its history. For decades, they helped the Palestinians. They sheltered them. They let them train there. They educated them. It was the most friendly state, one of the most friendly states in the Middle East towards the Palestinian people for decades. And that's one of the reasons for the absolute hatred that the imperialists had for them. And obviously the other one was oil and control of resources. But without any more from me, I'll let our comrade Alexander talk a bit more on the reasons for the imperialist war on Syria, how it opens and what happened during that war, and what led up to the final collapse of the Syrian army and state. Thank you.
I'll stand for this. Thank you, comrade, for the introduction. Before I get to the ins and outs of the situation in Syria, I wanted just to say a couple of words about Comrade Harpal's passing from my own perspective. And I know he'd tell me to get on with it as well, so I'll keep it as brief as I can. I wanted to say that the principal reason, one of the principal reasons why I'm able to be with you today and be talking in the way that I am about these issues is because of the work of Comrade Harpal Brar. Because it was only through the tradition that he, along with several other comrades of his generation, helped preserve, which is the real traditions of Marxism-Leninism, that so many of us who dropped out of Trotskyism, curse the word, or social democracy, or anarchism, and I've been unfortunate enough to go through all three in my in the last 25 years, so ask me questions later. But it was only when I started to actually read Comrade Harpal's work, starting with his analysis of the collapse of the Soviet Union in the book entitled Perestroika, and then his analysis of Trotskyism and social democracy, that the entire wretched, stinking corpse of the British left started to make sense to me in terms of, well, why do we always lose? Is the question that we should ask. Why is it that an anti-war movement that's been around for now almost 25 years has never succeeded in stopping a single war, but still calls itself the Stop the War Coalition? I mean, if there was such a thing as an enforcement of the Trades Descriptions Act, they should all be arrested. But it's only when you actually understand the true role of those who are the guiding forces behind the Stop the War Coalition. It's the revisionist non-communists of the Communist Party of Britain. It's the Trotskyites of the Socialist Workers' Party, the Spew Group, the Socialist Party of England and Wales, the others who are all rooted in the bureaucracy of the trade union movement and the labour aristocracy. It's only when you understand their role and what they are supposed to do that you understand why every movement they are engaged in always ends in failure, especially movements that are designed to get in the way of imperialist wars. And it was only through the engaging and learning from the work of Comrade Harpal in the books I've mentioned and other articles he has written over the long period of his revolutionary career that I was finally able to put the pieces together and make sense of the way in which the British left essentially operates as an appendage of the British ruling class. There is, comrades, no other explanation for it, and Comrade Harpal spelt that out very clearly and concisely in many works over the years. And I will just conclude my words on our esteemed and late comrade by just saying this. At a time when, 60 years ago, Marxism-Leninism was under siege from everybody, including the leadership of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in the form of the wretched Khrushchev, over to, of course, the propagandists of US and British and French imperialism, the Trotskyites and the various other things that spun off from them. At a time when all of these influences and the most powerful imperialist nations in the world and the supposedly socialist countries, their leadership, were all trying to bury Marxism-Leninism. Comrade Harpal and his comrades kept the tradition not only alive but added to it and enhanced it in Britain, one of the centres of global imperialism. So I think the value of his work cannot be overstated. I want to pay a personal tribute to the great value of it and the great value that I myself have found within it. So I will offer this as my own small tribute to him. Now, getting on with it, I will proceed to just talk a little bit about the background to the Syrian war and the collapse of the Syrian government and why it was that the US imperialists, the British imperialists, the French, the Germans, in fact all of the imperialist powers lined up behind their leader, the United States, in launching and sustaining a 13-year plus siege of Syria. So why was it that the US imperialists were so dedicated to their pursuit of the overthrow of the Syrian government? And I think we have some of the answers that have arrived over the last few days. Since the elevation to power of the group known as HTS, which even its allies in the West will acknowledge is a rebranded al-Nusra operation, who are in essence a rebranded al-Qaeda operation. Many of the men now elevated to positions of high office in Syria have been on terrorism watch lists, including Giuliani himself, who has been elevated into the office of president, including the foreign minister, who had a very nice sit-down with Tony Blair at Davos this week. I'm sure you all enjoyed that one. And more on Sir Anthony Charles Linton Blair later, because there is much to say about him. But why is it then that the men who were denounced at one point as terrorists are now welcomed into the Western Club as apparently civilized representatives of freedom and democracy? Well, the answer came partially at Davos earlier this week, comrades, when the new foreign minister sat down with Sir Anthony Charles Linton Blair. I always give him his full name because I refuse to call him Tony and make it seem like we're mates or something. the answer came when that minister said that his aim, or one of his aims, was the complete dismantling of what he called Ba'athist socialism. What does that mean? That means that the industrial base that the Syrian government had built up over the course of the previous over 50 years, the industrial base, the agricultural base, which had grown up under state management, all of that will now be dismantled, parceled up and sold off to various so-called investors from the imperialist countries. It is not a particularly hard job to track down who the beneficiaries of this always are. They are the firms that reside, of course, partially within the City of London, partially within New York, Paris, Berlin, and elsewhere in the European powers, and also within the realm of their master, the US imperialists. The breaking up of state-owned industries, the selling off of fertile agricultural land, the stealing of oil and other resources in all of these countries. This is a process, comrades, which of course has been going on for over 35 years since the counter-revolution that finally destroyed the Soviet Union. And this is, of course, what has been done in successive wars, waged often with the same propaganda, for the same garbage reasoning, and with the same lies told by the bourgeois press in Britain and elsewhere over and over again. Let's just take them in order, shall we? In the former Yugoslavia, same tactics in play, same players on the board, in fact. Al-Qaeda was in Bosnia in the mid-1990s. They were in Kosovo in 1999. They were working with the CIA and MI6 in both cases. Why? Specifically to do what Giuliani and the others are doing in Syria now, which is Yugoslavia, and again, this is not to go into the ins and outs of Titoism, but Yugoslavia did have a substantial state-based economy. It did have a substantial industrial base. It was relatively self-sufficient in certain areas, though not in others. And the investors, so-called, the parasites of the Western imperialist powers, looked upon that as something that needed to be conquered and destroyed and asset stripped, and turned from one relatively peaceful country that was relatively stable over many decades for all the undoubted flaws that the old Titoite system had, and turn it into several states that were weak, that had their industrial bases destroyed, that were then reduced to being dependent upon imports from the West. That's the game plan. They first enacted it properly in the former Yugoslavia between 1992 and then with the final overthrow of Milosevic in 2000. And that is exactly what they have done. Destroy the pre-existing industrial base, destroy the system of state-based agriculture. Why? And again, I reiterate the point, to make sure that, first of all, that profit is made off its destruction, and to reduce these countries to being dependencies of the West, where they have to import everything, they can't survive on their own, they are up to their necks in debt from the IMF and the World Bank and other major financial institutions. So a country like Bosnia, or a country like Montenegro or Macedonia, they are all bound into either the EU or NATO. They're all bound into these debts, these massive debts which they've taken on following years of so-called Western advice, i.e. orders, and therefore their governments are trapped. They're trapped in a military alliance they're called NATO that many of them they cannot get out of. They are trapped by debt. They don't have an industrial base anymore. They barely have an agricultural base anymore. That's the aim. That's what they did in Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia. It's what they did and they wanted to do in Iraq. It's what they have wanted to do ultimately for the real prize that they wanted at what was supposed to be the end of a series of regime change wars was going to be Iran. Thankfully, they haven't got to that. But to return to the question of why Syria and why the siege war for 13 years? Well, the question has to be addressed in terms of looking at the aims of US imperialism. The aims of US imperialism in going after Syria were, of course, to asset strip it and make as much money as possible in the process. But it fits into a much longer term plan. When the Soviet Union collapsed, suddenly the capacity of many countries to steer a somewhat independent path to development disappeared along with it. That was true of the countries that used to make up what was once referred to as the non-aligned movement. Many of those countries suddenly went from being able to develop in steering a path between the socialist bloc and the US imperialist bloc, to being told by the US after 1991, well, now you either adopt everything that we say, you basically turn over control of your country to us, or, or we will do to you what we just did to Iraq in 1991. What that Iraq war was in 1991 was designed to be a terrible warning to any country, no matter how small, that dared to stand outside of the control of what was once referred to as the so-called Washington Consensus. And so Iraq was an example. It's like a prison yard bully beating somebody up to send a message to everybody else, basically, which is what the US is. The US essentially acts like a gangster. They make examples out of people. They only pick fights that they know they can win. They can't pick fights with anybody who's actually capable of shooting back at them. This is how that they have operated for many, many years. The lesson taught to them by the Vietnamese in the 60s and early 70s is one they've never recovered from. Because I want to just mention this briefly, comrades. The lesson that they learnt from that was that they should never send large numbers of their own men again into these wars. And not without complete air supremacy, not without complete ability to bomb anywhere, destroy anything. Because if they do send their men in to an area where the population is unified behind a national liberation movement, as has happened in Gaza, as happened in Lebanon, what happens? The imperialist forces lose. Because the imperial soldiers, fundamentally, they might be imbued with racist propaganda. They might be convinced of the superiority, so-called, of the West. They might like sitting at home and being racist about the various different people they're sent off to kill. It's a lot different, though, when you're there in person. I'm going to be crude for a moment, comrades. Shitting yourself in fear of that an RPG's coming your way on the Gaza Strip. Then suddenly, the brave man who likes to sound off about the inferior races that he's going to fight is a lot less brave and often wants to get the hell out of there as soon as possible. Which is what has happened to the Israelis, both in Gaza and in Lebanon. They cannot beat, and this would go for the US as well, they cannot beat a people who are unified behind a national liberation struggle. So this happened in Korea, it happened in Vietnam, it has happened in Lebanon, it has happened to an extent in Gaza as well. Because no matter how much destruction imperialism can rain down upon a unified people, no matter how many of them that they can kill, they still could not break the spirit of resistance within those countries. And the US imperialists know that very well, which is why they adopt things like siege warfare, why they try to sanction countries to death, why they employ local proxies and employ mercenaries in huge numbers, paid for often in the case of Syria, in the case of Libya, paid for by the Gulf states like Qatar, the UAE, and elements within the Saudi regime. And so these are essentially modern-day mercenary armies that they send in there. Yes, they might call themselves various different variations of Islamic and Quranic titles, but fundamentally these are armies of mercenaries. If they weren't paid to be there, they wouldn't be there. How the hell do you think they get so many thousands of Uyghurs out of the Xinjiang region in China and take them all the way to Syria? Did these men go there on the strength of their belief in the Holy Quran? Well, maybe it helped, but I bet the gigantic amount of dollars helped as well. And the promise of giving them Syrian land, which is what Giuliani and the other al-Qaeda leaders were promising these men. You come to fight here, we'll give you land, we'll give you money, and we will dispossess various Syrians to give it to you. And this, of course, is coordinated ultimately by the US imperialists and their more local proxies, such as the Erdogan regime of Turkey, who is heavily involved in this as well. So the scheme in Syria was part of a much, much bigger project that, as I said, has been running since the early 1990s, where the playbook in terms of the propaganda is always the same. We can count the moves going all the way back 30 years to Yugoslavia, which is either Milosevic, Saddam Hussein, Muammar al-Gaddafi, or Bashar al-Assad. He's a dictator. He's torturing his own people. Do you know he does all these horrible made-up stories about torturing? Do you know that there's mass rape camps? That was a story about Kosovo. Again, turned out not to be true. Do you know there's all these hideous crimes that the roving bandit army of Milosevic or Saddam Hussein is committing? And of course, many of these things turned out to be wild exaggerations or outright lies. So that is then seeded in the bourgeois press to rile people up, especially people of liberal or leftist sensibilities. The imperialist governments know very well that if there is going to be an initial anti-war response, it will come from those particular sections of the population who are on the left. And so it's important in this new era of imperialist wars that they won over left-wing opinion to back them. And this is what they did in Yugoslavia. By demonizing the Milosevic-led federal Yugoslav government, they brought on board with them large elements of the British and American and Western European left who fell for the propaganda and bought it all. And they continued to buy it in every war that came afterwards. Even when we came to the Iraq War, I remember this very well, comrades, because I was active in the Stop the War Coalition at the time. They would begin a lot of their speeches, these Stop the War leaders, by saying, well, of course we agree that Saddam Hussein is this awful dictator who's done all of these things, and they would repeat the litany of crimes that the Ba'athist government of Iraq was accused of. And then they would say, but we should stop the war. Now, if you think about that for more than 10 seconds, comrades, you can see the problem with presenting the issue in that way. You've just spent the first element of a speech or an article or a contribution to a public debate saying that you agree with the case that's been made by the government, led by Tony Blair at the time. Oh shit, I called him Tony. Anthony Charles Linson Blair at the time, who, yeah, sir, who wants to tell you that the Baghdad government is the worst thing in the world and that's why we must act against it. So why on earth would you then, as a supposed anti-war activist, as a supposed leader of an anti-war movement, then spend the first few minutes of any speech or spend any time in any speech agreeing with the words of your enemy, an enemy who you know damn well is a proven liar, an enemy you know damn well is an enemy of the domestic working class? Why would you take him seriously if you don't believe a word he says on domestic issues? Why on earth would you take him seriously about a country that's thousands of miles away, that most people in this country will never go to, and many of them couldn't point to on a map? Why do you think he's suddenly telling the truth about that, good comrades? Has that ever been asked? Has anybody actually had that conversation? Because this is the ridiculous thing. It is like you find these the leftists, the Trotskyites, the revisionists who run the anti-war movement will tell you all day and all night that the Labour Party and the Tories lie about everything. But suddenly, when it comes to countries that are so far away, well, suddenly their claims are valid. Well, that doesn't make an ounce of sense unless you understand what the actual role of the British left is, comrades. And that is not to act as the militant organising faction within the working class, to act as communists should act, which is to be amongst the people, both learn from the masses, to paraphrase the words of the great Chairman Mao, learn from the masses and teach the masses at the same time in a continual interactive process. No, they're not doing that. What are they doing? They're sitting in permanent jobs in the trade union bureaucracy. They're sitting in, somewhat, shall we say, cozy existences in academia, agreeing with the latest talking points and making sure that they don't offend the latest sensibilities once they've checked what the latest sensibilities are, and making sure that they echo every talking point that comes out of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. That's what a great number of the British left and the American left, and the same is true in Europe, is actually doing. And so when it comes to something like Iraq, which was such an obscene and aggressive act of war, such an overt act of imperialism, yes, the left in Britain had to make it look as if they opposed it. But they did so in a way that did not use the vast amount of working class opinion that was against that war in a way that could have stood a chance of stopping it. So, and then when the US imperialists ran into problems with Iraq, they switched tactics for the rest of the countries that they wanted to conquer. They didn't send their army directly into Libya because they'd already had the experience of getting shot up too badly in Iraq. So what did they do? They hired vast numbers of what I'm going to call dollar jihadists, people who might say that they're waging a jihad but are essentially paid mercenaries going to Libya, going to Syria, as I said, to basically ransack and loot the place on behalf of imperialism. And when it came to Libya, when it came to Syria, of course, because British forces were not going to be directly deployed, at least not admitted to being directly deployed. We know subsequently that there were special forces sent in there. We know the British Air Force was active in both cases. But fundamentally, the difficulty that the anti-war movement faced was that that you needed to get across to people that these were still very much British wars. The war in Libya was a British war. The war in Syria was a British war. It wouldn't happen in the same way, at least, if the British government was forced to pull out of it. But unfortunately, rather than making these points over and over again, and rather than drawing the working class's attention towards the fact that we as a class have an absolute definitive interest in stopping these wars, because it is our class enemy at home who wages these wars abroad, not for our benefit, but for their benefit, not to make sure that, not to even give the slightest concession in the way that they did briefly in the 1940s, but to keep their own rotting and decaying system afloat by ransacking an oil-rich country for a few years, leaving it in ruins, and like a plague of locusts or a ravening band of vampires, move on to the next victim, then suck that dry as well. And that is what imperialism is. And that needs to be got across to people here, because the same people who are making sure that working class communities slowly fall into more and more poverty, where our infrastructure goes to rack and ruin, where people's paying conditions just go down and down and down, the same people making war on the working class at home are making war upon the oppressed people of the world in other countries. We have a common enemy. It was Comrade Stalin who said, all the way back in the Foundations of Leninism in 1924, that the natural ally of the proletariat of the West are the oppressed peoples in the areas of the world commonly referred to as the East. We should be building an alliance between ourselves, the proletariat of the West, whose living standards are getting squeezed, whose manner of existence is getting worse, with the people who are the targets of our own ruling class. Because, to reiterate the point, we share the same enemy. And until we realize that point, we are going to be fighting with one arm tied behind our backs. And the leaders of the Stop the War coalition, these so-called leaders, what did they do? Did they ever make those points? Did they ever actually go out and advocate for this amongst the working class? No. I remember all of this very well. What we got was watery pacifism. Stop the war because it's not nice. It was never explained why the war was being waged. It was not explained what the motivations, real motivations of the US imperialists are, which is, of course, to continually absorb all these different countries, to destroy their economies, to asset strip them, to loot their oil resources or anything else. Why? In order to stave off the crisis, the terminal crisis afflicting their own system. US imperialism has been in a series of crises, I would argue, since the middle of the 1960s. Since it became obvious that they couldn't fund the Vietnam War, that they were going into a severe internal crisis due to dissent over it, and that the fact that the big profitability boost post-World War II had ended. Since that point, 60 years ago, we in Britain and in the US, the imperialist countries, have gone through a series of booms and slumps, and now we are in a very, very long depression that began in 2008. And that is the basis, that is the root cause as to why these wars are waged. To stave off collapse domestically for another few years, more and more countries have to be ransacked and destroyed. And that is why they will not stop these wars. They won't. They can't. If they stopped the wars for a second, then the system would start to shake. If they weren't continually trying to loot and successfully looting and making war on other countries, then the loot that goes through the city of London and through New York and through Paris and through Berlin, if that stopped, then the system would start to fall to pieces, because the remaining social concessions that have been made to the domestic working class, what's left of them, the ruling class would have to attack those in order to preserve themselves. They can only sustain themselves by continually launching wars of aggression overseas. And that is what should have been explained and what should have been used as a mobilizing factor for the working class here. And it never really was. Instead, what did we get? We got the Stop the War coalition agreeing with the imperialists about about the Iraqi government, agreeing with them about the Libyan government, agreeing with them about the Syrian government, and then trying to hide behind different causes, such as the Kurdish cause, such as my comrade Dan correctly pointed out, the imaginary workers' councils that they always manage to find due to a rogue tweet somewhere on the internet that they say, oh, there's workers' councils in Libya. Where are they? Well, I can't tell you now, but there was this tweet that I translated badly from Arabic, which said the word council, and that justifies my entire party's position now. Whereas in reality, what were they doing when it came to Libya, when it came to Syria? Well, I'll give you a personal anecdote. 14 years ago now, when the Libya war was still on, when I was a member of an organisation that I will only call SPEW, it stands for Socialist Party of England and Wales if you're not familiar with the acronym, though it is a very appropriate acronym if you know the organisation. They sent us in Manchester to go and leaflet at what they said was a demonstration of exiled Libyans. Now, exiled Libyans in Manchester, if you're familiar with certain events in Manchester in 2017, might call to mind certain groups of people. And these certain groups of people are, of course, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group and various other entities who are dedicated to being opponents of the Gaddafi-led government, who are long-term assets of the British intelligence services. So that's who the Trotskyite group I was in back in the day was asking us to go and leaflet and make friends with up in Manchester back in 2011. By the way, for purposes of full disclosure, we didn't like the look of them, so we didn't do it. So it undermined it in that way. But those were the allies that they were seeking back then. The same people who are allies of the US and the British imperialists, who are their tools most of the time. And that's the way in which the so-called anti-war movement has acted for so many years. It concedes all the points that imperialism makes. It concedes to all the propaganda. It never makes a clear and concise and understandable case to the working class as to why we here and the Libyans and the Syrians and the Iraqis and the Iranians share the same enemy and share an interest in bringing that enemy down. Because if you're somebody who is in the better off end of the working class or the middle class, maybe you can still just about fool yourselves that things in this country are tolerable or going in the right direction. Maybe you can kid yourself if you close your eyes, put your fingers in your ears and don't watch anything, don't see the gigantic number of homeless people on the streets. But if you're anywhere near the great majority of the working class, you have got to have reached an understanding. You don't have to be a Marxist yet. You understand that your own life is becoming remarkably unsustainable in terms of costs. You understand that things are getting worse and have been getting worse for many, many years now. And that no matter how many countries the British government ransacks, it never seems to get any better. And so we have an interest in bringing down this system, this repulsive parasitic entity known as the British ruling class. We share an interest in defeating them with our brothers and sisters in these countries of what is called, either you can call it the third world, the global south, whatever you want to address it as, the people who have been oppressed and who are being murdered by imperialism. They are our brothers and sisters in struggle, and we should join with them in a joint struggle against the British ruling class and against US imperialism. And I'll turn now just to conclude things, comrades, to some examples of practical action. What should an anti-war movement be doing that it is not? Well, primary amongst those demands that should be made and popularised within the working class, but which is not, is the question of NATO, and it is the question of the US military presence in Britain and all the way across Europe. You see, the essence of the European situation since 1945 is that the European ruling classes have been allowed to stay in place by the US. But to guarantee their good behaviour, the US puts military bases in all of the NATO countries. Why? Is it to protect them from the Russian horde that is about to stream forth through Ukraine and conquer all of Europe, comrades? I very much doubt it. Those military bases in Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and of course Germany and Italy, they're not there to protect against the Russians, not really. They are there to secure the good behaviour of the domestic government, because that's what it's always really been about. Just as I said, US imperialism is a gangster organisation. And so the gangster needs his local rough guys to sit in those countries and to make sure that whoever sits in the Elysee Palace, whoever sits in the Bundestag knows his place, knows that basically the first call he's going to get or has to make, in all likelihood, is probably to the US president, who says, well, congratulations on your election, here's your agenda. Something along those lines. And if you step out of line, well, there's 40,000 armed guys just sat there. Also, we completely control your domestic security system. We've got spies everywhere. We know everything that you're doing. You might as well just go along with it and get a payoff at the end. I mean, I'm being somewhat crude and shorthand there, but not by much, comrades. The point is that the presence of NATO, the presence of the US occupation forces, which is what they are. You ever notice that the Soviet forces that liberated Eastern Europe were referred to as occupation forces, but the NATO forces in the West were referred to, if they were referred to at all, as our valuable allies? Interesting choice of language there. But the point is, it is a deliberate policy by the US to ensure the compliant behaviour of the European states, to ultimately to secure the compliant behaviour of the British state. That's why they have their air bases here. It's why they have their forces here. It's why ultimately they control the supposedly independent British nuclear deterrent, which isn't independent and doesn't deter anybody. The US controls all the different systems, the electronic systems that go into that missile system, and the Ministry of Defence admits to it in its internal papers, reviewing the system's risks. They say that so much of it is dependent upon the US, it lacks credibility as an independent deterrent. So who are the British ruling class kidding, other than they're trying to kid us, of course? And the usage of NATO and the military occupation of Europe was made crystal clear both in the war in Ukraine and in the war upon the people of Gaza and the people of Lebanon. The spy flights that flew from the British air bases in Cyprus over Gaza every single day, what were they doing? Who were they gathering intelligence for? David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, won't tell us. Perhaps he doesn't even know. Because I think he's probably just about smart enough not to ask his intelligence chiefs that question. Because those flights would take place whether David Lammy was there or whether the Tories were in power or whoever was in government, that assistance to the Israeli regime would still be in place because, of course, the Israeli regime acts as the brutish sword arm of US and British imperialism in the region, as it has always done. And so the presence of the US, the existence of NATO, the existence of the US network of military bases all the way across Europe is there to secure domestic compliance and to project aggressive force, of course, onto opponents of US imperialism. And so our demand within the anti-war movement should be, and this should be popularized, that the American military presence in Britain needs to go. It needs to be dismantled. The bases need to be turned back over to our own control. That Britain needs to leave NATO as it left the EU, and that NATO needs to be dismantled because it is an aggressive and destabilizing force that is only leading the workers of Europe towards greater and greater levels of destruction. That is what the focus of anti-war work should be, comrades. And there is a reason why the leftists who run the anti-war movement will never go near those demands in a serious way. It is because once you touch the holy trinity of British nuclear weapons, the American presence in Britain, and the existence of NATO, you are going near the free things which uphold British imperialism's ever loosening grip upon its remaining imperial possessions and the remaining markets that it's dominating. Those are the free things which prop up British imperialism these days. And if those are removed, or if any one of them is removed, then the British ruling class will start to see its power fall apart, which is exactly why we must be making those demands and explaining to our class why it is so important that we campaign on such a basis and why we aim at the heart of the beast in order that we are to stand any chance of slaying this repulsive entity before it takes us all down to the depths of hell with it. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you, Comrade Alex. I'm sure everyone will agree that was very, very enlightening and very correct talk. Looking very good, but it gets to the heart of, what is wrong with the war movement in this country is that it's not an anti-imperialist movement. It has no understanding of anti-imperialism, and in fact it doesn't want one because they're paid off by the Social Democrats, and that's how they make their living. I think the point you made about the risk of the imperialists, if they're not continually at war, if they're not expanding their exploitation, because according to the rules of capitalism there has to be constant expansion, constant growth, and that can't happen in finite spaces, so they have to attack other countries, whether that's financially or ultimately militarily if they can't completely dominate somewhere through economic means. They need to keep the super profits flowing in from their imperialist conquests, but they're unable to do that. Like I pointed out, the Vietnam War was incredibly expensive for the Americans, but it also coincided with the biggest anti-war movement because there was the draft. They were putting American working class people into war, and that proved immensely unpopular because there was a huge anti-war movement saying, actually, no, we have no interest in fighting the Vietnamese. It's not our business. These are just normal people. These are farmers halfway across the world. Why are you sending us to fight these people? And it birthed a huge anti-war movement. Similarly, there was the risk for them after World War I, when all the soldiers came back, having experienced the horrors of World War I, and were sent back to live in poverty. They were told by the British ruling class, thank you very much for your service. We've secured the profits coming in from the British Empire. We've defeated our imperialist rivals. They didn't say that, but that's what they were thinking. That's what happened. Now go back to whatever you were doing before. We don't know what that is, whether that was living in a slum and not being able to find work, or working in a factory or down a mine, and if you're disabled, tough luck. And so those gave birth to both large, popular, widespread, but also organised, militant anti-war movements. And those were the times of the biggest threat to the ruling classes in those countries. And that was also the time when they were developing and implementing the biggest countermeasures towards that in terms of executing the leaders of organised communist movements, anti-imperialist movements, anti-war movements. And let's, we have to be clear, they don't play around at this. When they talk about democracy and freedom of speech, they mean it until a certain point. They mean it until the threat to them is real. And when the threat to them is real, they will respond to your freedom of speech, your democracy, which is a bourgeois democracy not for you, it's the illusion of democracy. They respond to that with violence, with arrest, with executions. Well, I want to talk a little bit about some of my experience in the anti-war movement over the past 10 years, particularly with Syria being a focal point, precisely because it was such a contentious issue amongst the left, or what you would call the left, which is now a kind of nebulous, meaningless term. But in the anti-war movement, in the organised, anti-war movement with Trotskyites and Social Democrats and all flavours of people who think they're against war but are not anti-imperialists as they should be, there were all kinds of misleading trends and currents, particularly in Stop the War, but others, who were able to be misled and mislead others by all these ideas of, well, we don't like Bashar al-Assad, the media or the government tells us he's a bad man, so we shouldn't get too involved. We shouldn't say, victory to Syria. We shouldn't support the defeat of the imperialists and the victory of the anti-imperialists. You have to have some nuance. That was the key word back in the day of nuance. But in war, there's victory or defeat for us. And as Alex pointed out, our brothers and sisters in the anti-imperialist struggle are on the side of the working class. That's us, that's you and me. The British workers have more in common with the normal people of Syria than we do with the British ruling class's interests in destroying and dominating and controlling Syria. So if our interest is in the same interest in the Syrians that are fighting against Western imperialism, then we have to call for their victory. Their victory is our victory. And we have to work for their victory as well. Not just in words, but in deeds. But throughout that entire period, it was very eye-opening. We gain so much from studying our history and theory. But there really is no substitute for combining that with experience. You can sit at home and read all the books you want, but to combine it with the experience, to experience these things, to go through them, to see them, is the best teacher. And what we saw throughout that period of the anti-war movement in Syria, particularly from the perspective of trying to impart to people, no, we want the defeat of the imperialists and the victory of the anti-imperialists. We want the defeat of the terrorists. We want the defeat of NATO and the US and British forces that are covertly operating in Syria. And we want the victory of Assad and the Ba'athist government. Not because we want that model of Ba'athism, of social democracy and welfare in their context, but because it's not our right to decide what is right for them. It's the right of the Syrian people, and certainly not the right of our imperialist forces, our bourgeoisie, to decide what should happen to the Syrian people. And there's a reason, the US embassy in Baghdad is not only the largest embassy in the world, it's its own isolated military fort within the isolated green zone in Baghdad. So the green zone, I don't know if you remember, during the 2003 Iraq War, was set up in the middle of Baghdad with heavy checkpoints, cordons, a bit like the City of London. They fortified that because they were afraid of the IRA. So there's actually, if you go through the City of London, it's full of checkpoints and one-way systems and cameras and stuff. It's been dismantled a bit because they're not so worried anymore. But within that, they built an entirely self-sufficient, self-contained embassy, like a fortress. And they've done the same in London with the new US embassy. The new US embassy has a moat. It has bastions, like big earthwork walls. It's an impenetrable fortress. It has missile-proof screens and windows on the outside to stop any attack on it. So they're clearly anticipating enough of a level of hatred against the US in Britain that they're afraid their embassy might have rockets or missiles fired at it.
They're building one now in Lebanon.
And they're building a huge one in Lebanon.
23 acres.
And these are their new military bases, essentially. And they have a huge amount of... The embassy in Baghdad is completely cut off. It has its own petrol generation for electricity or diesel generators that cost it $20 million a year just to generate the electricity for the whole embassy complex. But what really opened my eyes was the hypocrisy and almost open support for terrorists by the British government. And that occurred during Libya. And I was researching the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, who were based in South Manchester, in Whalley Range and around there, and were, despite being a proscribed organisation, the members of that organisation were essentially given carte blanche to fly from between Britain and Libya, and later on those same terrorists were flying from Libya directly or from Britain to go to Syria. And it's not a coincidence that every time there's a terrorist attack in Britain, they were known to security forces. They're all known to the security services. They're all known to the security services because they're all potential assets being used to destabilise other countries. And it was very enlightening as well to see the propaganda machine in overdrive, bringing out everything it could to try and drum up support for the war in Syria. But I think there's a couple of reasons I don't think they managed to achieve support. I remember when they defeated in Parliament, the motion to go and bomb Syria again was defeated in 2015, 2016, maybe 2017. But around that as well, Stop the War were not a useful anti-war vehicle. On the anti-war demonstrations, they were very upset that there were pictures of Assad. Some people were carrying Assad banners or Assad placards. You know, these are people supporting the country that is the target of imperialist aggression. We're saying, don't bomb this country. And yet the marshals, the stewards, the organisers of Stop the War are saying, do not carry the symbols of this country. It might be used by the media to make the demonstration look bad. It was Chris Nynham in particular, by the way, who was just arrested gently by the Metropolitan Police on the last Palestine demonstration. It was Chris Nynham saying that, and they did nothing about the terrorists that were on the march. These were the three-star Free Syrian Army terrorists that were on the march, chanting, death to Assad, behead the infidels. They were the HTS, al-Nusra at the time, terrorists. And they scared off the secular Syrians who did come to some of the marches, but were targeted by these FSA people. So this was an anti-war demonstration where you've invited the proxies, or you've allowed the proxies of the imperialists to dominate the demonstration, scare off any secular Syrians that were in attendance. It's absolutely shameful and exposes the real nature of the Stop the War movement. And the Kurds have been another point of contention. What about the Kurds? What about Rojava? And I think that comes back down to the national liberation question and how we understand that as Marxists. And we always have to judge it by one thing. And that's the same thing we judge everything, which is, does this advance the cause of the working class or not? And in that instance, what the PKK and YPG did is ally themselves with US Special Forces for their own narrow interests, forsaking the wider interests of the working class in the region and the world, because they allied themselves with the imperialist forces, destabilizing and cutting off the Syrian Arab army and the Syrian nation, the Syrian state, from being able to access the oil and the wheat in the northeast of Syria. And it's contributed massively to the destruction of the Syrian state. And as Trump said the last time he was president, quite plainly about Syria, we're there for the oil. So the Kurds allowed themselves to be used in their narrow pursuit of national self-determination in that area by the US to extract vital resources, oil and food from Syria while it was fighting all these terrorist proxy forces. And they essentially became another wing, another appendage of the imperialist proxy army fighting for imperialism. And we can see what situation that's left them in, where they're now being attacked by the invading Turkish forces. Well, they've made their bed, and now they have to lie on it. But was Syria a defeat for the working class? It undoubtedly was. It's weakened the anti-imperialist movement, there is no doubt. But this is the loss of a battle, not the war. And we must impart on the British working class, like Alex was saying, the anti-war movement must call for the defeat of imperialists and for the victory of the anti-imperialists. We must call for the defeat of NATO. We must call for the withdrawal of the US from Britain. And we must call for real peace, not some fake, vague notion of liberal peace without real peace. Real peace means socialism. Real peace means communism. It's what we have to bring into the anti-war movement. Thank you, comrades. So yeah, I think if anyone has any questions or contributions they want to make, especially if anyone doesn't mind being on camera, but please let us know. You don't have to be on camera. We don't have to record, include your contributions. So I had quite a few hands. Comrade there first, and then, sorry, I forget your... Alex, and then comrade.
I can go last since I'm not really a member.
You don't have to be a member to go first or last. We don't mind.
Okay,
so comrade Alex first. If you
But I'll
don't,
be an American and come in.
it's allowed.
This is a safe space.
We'll take a couple at a time, comrades. I'm not. So Alex,
Yeah. I don't believe it began in Yugoslavia. It actually began in Afghanistan. I was fortunate enough to visit Afghanistan in 1981-82, and it was a Soviet-type country. Women had a right to an education. Women had a right to a career. I was actually treated by an Afghan woman who was trained to be a doctor in Kabul. And it was the United States who used this, as Comrade Alexander said, the dollar Islamists to destabilise the government, to bring down the government. When I was in Afghanistan, people used to laugh at the nutters, wanting a fundamentalist country. They were a figure of fun in Afghanistan. How they destabilised Afghanistan, brought it down, was this place masquerading, whatever they call it, Pakistan, bringing in their terrorists to do murder and mayhem, blowing up buses with women and children. This was the hallmark which they used across the world. They brought down a Soviet-type government. I was able to travel on the roads, which was built by Afghan people from one end to another. They had free education, free healthcare, access to work. It was a multi-ethnic country, and by supporting the terrorists, the dollar Islamists, they brought down a very successful country. I won't go on, but Afghanistan was really a very successful country. But they brought it down, they bombed it back to the Middle Ages, and that's what they want to do around the world. They did it successfully in Libya, and they're going to do it successfully in Syria if we don't put a stop to it.
thank you, Comrade. I think that's a really important point. Thank you for contributing. Sorry, I don't know your name.
Tara,
Tara, lovely.
imperialist. Sorry. I can't,
Are you invading us?
I'm frustrated. Yes, if I may, I think I'd like to make some boring factual points, or maybe factual counterpoints, and then maybe one, what's the word, more political or ideological. So the first one, and just an overall theme of my comments, is that there's no shortage of grievances and bad things that imperialism has done. So what? What are you going to do about it? I mean, it's just kind of, and Alexander had said, they're a gangster or whatever, and I was thinking, like, for example, if there was a petition, there was enough people in the UK are like, we want the US military presence out, well, go talk to South Korea. There's a lot of people who want it out.
Absolutely.
Go talk to Japan, they want it out, and they're still there. So, and I think that the base here, we talk about so I'm like, are they weak or are they not weak? I think it very much depends on how and where you look. So if they have this compound in London, they have the huge one in Iraq, they have one in Lebanon. I mean, so on the surface, it's like, okay, but you're telling me they're weak, and it's like the decline, and it could be a very long decline. So I'm just trying to, and this goes into when you brought up Vietnam, yes, but they adapted, yeah? So there's not a draft anymore, it's a volunteer army. And I would say, with all due respect, you can't compare the TikTok Israeli army to the American army. The core and crux of it, and then I think it's important to make the distinction, because we would want as many military people to be on our side, right? They are oftentimes, when they go through that process, they have a lot to offer. But there's a difference between the middle to the bottom soldiers and the middle to the top. And so if you look at Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan, they were like, oh, let's just do this, but like, well, we take this hill and then we lose it, or we go to this village and then we don't. We're parting, and they would say, like, why are we working with these people or whatnot? But the politics, so they're very much able to maybe like win the battle, or the military part of it, but then the political part afterwards, when the goal of the administration is to put in a regime that most of the people then don't like or don't respect, then of course all this stuff falls apart. But don't make any mistake that the US military is quite serious. Now, the upper people, what they're doing, I mean, who knows? And I'm wondering, is it a weakness that they have to rely, Alexander, so much on proxies and whatnot? Because that seems to be working out quite well for them. Because if you can reduce the body bags coming home, and you can have it as a volunteer army, and it's still very much a lower class, working class thing. There are some families where it's customary to, go to West Point and all this stuff. And it's amazing, it doesn't take really much training to be in the frame of mind of unit, yeah? And anybody who's weak, who puts the unit in danger, is going to have a serious thing. So I would just say that I would just be a bit wary about assuming that with the middle to below, not the other people, whatever. And I guess that's just the point is, what are you going to do about it? They respond to violence and they respond to force. And if you're not prepared to do that, like with Hamas and those people, to show up, there are chinks in Israel's armor, if you're willing to pay the price, yeah? So I very much agree with you that that people weren't celebrating in Tel Aviv, but don't get too excited about the ceasefire, because who's going to stop them if they go on again? And I'm not saying they can't be stopped, but I'm saying, yeah, they're wrong. Yeah, it's terrible. Yes, yes, yes. And? I don't know, if America, I'll finish up here. This is a hypothetical, yeah? Because I'm not a citizen. But let's say there was a thing like, hey, we want the US, there's a groundswell, and then they debated in the House of Commons or whatever, and the US is like, and the Commons are like, and then what? I'm thinking about the vote also in the EU, and the people in the EU countries voted wrong, and they're like, oh, well, you voted wrong to Holland and whatnot.
Do it again.
Yeah, do it again. So as long as we take this up the whatever, we're going to continue to get it.
Yeah.
So I'll leave it there.
I think, firstly,
Sorry.
fantastic points and questions. Thank you very much. And I agree, those are all the right questions to be asking.
Oh, well, thank you.
I would say, I'll let Alex
Unfortunately.
jump in on this as well. When we talk about the US, or when I talk about imperialism being weak or US being weak, the system is very unstable. The economic base is very unstable. Because
it's not the nature of capitalism. That's kind of its.
In some senses, we've seen it in the imperialist nations in Britain and America particularly, but Western Europe, all these old imperialist nations have found it cheaper to outsource almost their entire industrial base, not entirely, but a significant amount to other countries. And there's very little now that is actually produced in our countries, apart from maybe you could say very specialist military equipment, but a lot of it's quite distributed as well. So there's no holistic manufacturing. And they found it very hard with all the military aid and material they've sent to Ukraine. They found it very difficult to replace that. Part of the idea behind that was, well, we'll use the human cannon fodder of the Ukrainians to fight Russia for us, try and weaken our enemy, another proxy attack. But they found it very difficult actually to replace that material, because where is the wealth coming from? As Alex pointed out, as the super profits from being able to successfully wage wars.
Okay, but
can I just finish the point, and then we do have a lot of other people to speak as well. As the profits from being able to successfully wage wars and exploit other countries dry up, and examples like Libya are not what they would like. They ended up with 3 or 4 different governments in Libya. Russia now has a base in one area of Libya. That's not what they want. They want to be able to dominate a whole country, but they're not able to dominate it. It's not peaceful in Iraq for them. That what they want is to be able to own a country wholesale in terms of its entire political and ideological alignment, like Germany. Germany is so Americanized in terms of worshipping America, being so happy with the American bases, etc. Not so happy when they're trying to push them towards war with Russia, although they've come around to accept that now. But they want that total control, total domination. It's a sign of weakness if you have to control people through force. If you can't convince someone to go along with you willingly, if you have to convince them through force, that is a massive sign of weakness. So it's not that they're not dangerous. It's not that they're not well equipped. It's not that they don't have the armies and the materials to do a significant amount of damage to any country in a war. It's a weakness in terms of their ideology. It's a weakness in terms of their economic system, the whole economic system of imperialism. But I'll let Alex come in on that. I'm sure there's a few points.
I'll take the first 2 points. First of all, the comrades' point down the front about Afghanistan. I would say that the crucial point that war changed was when the Soviet leadership itself capitulated. The Afghan army and its Soviet allies were starting to get on top of the situation with the dollar jihadists towards the middle point of the 1980s. And it was when it wasn't the Stinger missiles, it wasn't Sylvester Stallone or Timothy Dalton in that Bond movie that was set there. It was the fact that the Gorbachev leadership arranged a calculated capitulation with the US imperialists, sold out their former Afghan ally, and then, but even there though, with to go to the point the comrade was making, the state that the Soviets helped to build in Afghanistan was a lot stronger than the state that the US and the British built there. That folded like paper overnight. It took another 2.5 to almost 3 years for the Afghan government that had been built by the Soviets and the PDPA, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, to finally fall to the dollar jihadists in the early 1990s. So I would say that it's the Soviet leadership's role in that, in carrying out a calculated act of treachery that was the difference, or one of the big differences there. Now, to go to Tara's point about, well, what are you going to do about it? It's a valid question, because every time we saw with the Corbyn movement, when the British ruling class said, well, we're not going to have any of that. What did the left have? Surrender. That was basically it. So what if you got what if our former friends in the WPB, for instance, the Workers' Party of Britain led by George Galloway, what if they got elected into a majority in the British House of Commons, as long as His Majesty King Charles assents to it, of course, and they put forward a bill saying Britain will withdraw from NATO. Well, what will happen is, as other comrades have said, the ruling class and the security structure will say, that's interesting, we're not doing that. There's, of course, a myriad ways of blocking such things, but there will just it'll be blocked bureaucratically, or there'll just be a refusal to do it, or they will engineer an economic crisis or a political crisis, and they will chase that government out. They will penetrate it, they will find unreliable elements within it, they will undermine it in 1,000 different ways, and then they will collapse it. That's what they'll do, which is why when we make demands like this, when we go out, when we say to people, say to comrades that we should popularize this within the anti-war movement, are we saying that we expect that the NATO withdrawal bill will be presented to the House of Commons and sail through for royal assent? No, we're not saying that at all, because there's 1,000 ways that they can block it. It's why it's a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, because no matter which government is in, it's still their dictatorship. And so we don't expect that. What we do expect by raising the demand initially with workers, initially what we're doing is we're engaging in a propagandizing and consciousness raising exercise. We're saying to people like this, these are the reasons why the situation is as it is. These are the actual sources of power of the ruling class. Because unless the working class knows what the sources of power of the ruling class actually are, and too many workers at the moment just do not know that, then they don't know who the enemy is. And if you don't know who the enemy is, you stand no chance of ever really fighting them. So you raise the demands to raise consciousness. Then you soon start to build movements that are built on a more proper and secure ideological basis than you have at the moment. The reason why Corbynism failed, the reason why all reformist efforts in Britain fail, is because they're not clear about any of that. They don't tell people who the enemy is. They don't tell people what will be necessary to defeat it. Because to get the US out of your country is no mean feat. It is no easy task. You have to make sure that you, i.e. us, the workers, would have to be actually in control of the state. That's what we would have to be. That we would have to actually reach the point where we would be in the process of getting rid of the British ruling class. Because the British ruling class are not going to agree to the departure of the United States and the dismantling of NATO. As I said, it's what their power is based on. You get rid of them, you get rid of the US, then the British ruling class know that they're not that far behind. So it's a matter of being very clear with people. We are not going to get rid of the US by asking nicely. We're not going to get rid of the US military presence by putting a petition into Downing Street or even electing a government. It is a matter of taking ourselves to the point where the basis of power of the ruling class can be challenged by the power of the organised working class. Now, I make absolutely no apology for trying to present this without any illusions or sugarcoating. This is not easy. It is not going to be easy. We are faced with a very uphill battle. To build our presence in working class communities, to take the awareness of what we have been talking about here, of who the enemy is and what will be necessary to defeat them, to take that to people is not going to be an easy task, given that most working class people in this country and the rest of the imperialist countries have been told that politics is a cross in a box every 4 years if you're very lucky. And you look at the price that the Palestinians have been made to pay, and you look at the price the Lebanese have been made to pay by the proxy of US imperialism, that is Israel, for their defiance, or the price that the Russians are being made to pay for securing their own existence and their own state, or the price that the Iranians have paid for having their revolution 40 years ago. These aren't particularly pleasant things to go out and say to people that the ruling class is going to do to them, but that's what the ruling class will do to us if we try and do this. There's no point pretending otherwise, comrades. But we are in a situation where we have to be straight with the working class if we are to stand any chance of actually winning the advanced workers over to us. And therefore, I have no problem to going to workers and actually being absolutely upfront about this, that it is going to be a long and a tough struggle. And the ultimate aim is the removal of the British ruling class from power. And only by doing that do we stand a chance of actually addressing the points we've been talking about here. The point about why we raise them as points of agitation right now is to start the process of making workers aware of what the enemy's power is based on, why it is the way that it is, and why it will be so difficult to break down and remove that power. There's no Jeremy Corbyns or even George Galloways that are going to do this for us. It is only the mass mobilization of the politicized working class that has reached a higher state of class consciousness that stands any chance through sheer numbers and organisation and mobilisation of actually removing the hold that the British ruling class has over us and removing the US military presence here. And one final point to answer the point about class divisions within the armed forces. We should absolutely make an appeal to the working class that gets dragged into, via what's called economic conscription, into the armed forces of the imperialist nations, be that the United States, where the great majority of the recruits are from the poorest backgrounds, be that they're poor white Southerners, poor black Americans from the urban areas or the rural areas, poor Hispanics, or people who've just arrived and are taken into the armed forces of the United States, like green card soldiers, they're called. Those people, they have joined the army for a variety of reasons, but for most of them, they're like most of the guys that joined from my hometown. It's because there's nothing else. There's nothing else going on. So they join up and they might learn a skill and might earn a bit more when they get out. But they still have families in the working class. They still see that their families' living standards are sinking. They still see the fact, they still feel the reality of the decline of the living standards of the American and the British working class. Therefore, we absolutely must have an appeal to them. We must say to them that our struggle is not against you, the worker in uniform, who has joined the armed forces for X, Y, or Z reason, whatever reason. It is against the tiny numbers in the officer corps. It is against the people they serve. It is against the landowners. It is against the capitalist class, who are a tiny number of people. That is who the war is against, because that is who is making war upon us. And so we invite them to come along with us, we invite them to join us, and we invite them to join us in educating themselves as we are and learning about the truest weapon that will give you the real edge against the ruling class, and that is the weapon of Marxism-Leninism.
Very well put, comrade. Thank you. And I'll just briefly add, and then we'll come on, and we'll come back to you at the end if that's okay.
No,
It's
it's
got
okay.
a lot of names. Okay, no worries.
I'm just excited to be here.
That's good. But I'll just make one point about social democracy and the drying up of these imperialist super profits that are causing the imperialists to start cannibalising the benefits, the crumbs they've given to the working class here. That's tied in with, after the October Revolution, the imperialist nations started having to pay lip service to the ideals of the October Revolution. What happened during the October Revolution? Freedom, democracy, emancipation, not in words, but in deed, in reality for the working classes, in reality for oppressed nations. And suddenly, the imperialists had to start paying lip service in that. In the era of decolonialisation, in the era of anti-imperialist struggle, the imperialists started saying they were having to fight for freedom and democracy and human rights and all these things, because what's then to stop everyone turning to communism that is actually providing these things for people? But as the imperialist super profits dry up, they can no longer rule in the old way. The money that they've been spending on buying off and pacifying the working class in imperialist countries is drying up, and life here is getting worse for people. And it's that experience, it's the experience for when people demand healthcare, it's the experience of when people demand safe, clean houses to live in, being able to feed their children, to heat their homes, and being told no. And then when they get angry about it, they get hit with a baton in the face or taken to jail. When they're upset about a war or a genocide that our government is supporting, they're silenced, interrogated by police, and terrified and traumatised, or worse. So there are two conditions necessary for revolution. It's that the working class can no longer go along in the old way. But neither can the upper class, neither can the ruling class rule in the old way. Harpreet, you had your hand up?
No, sorry.
Okay, no worries. Right, go on.
First of all, I would recommend to everybody to watch Alex's interview with Iranian communist, because this was the best that I've seen that explains the situation within Iran. So that was first thing. And second is Gulf kingdoms. So they are paying for terrorists. Erdogan is only training them. Then we have the same kingdoms in Congo, in Africa, together with those imperialist states, and they are committing genocide with them. They are paying terrorists in Africa. And I think their resources are not endless. And where would you fit these $600 billion that Trump asked them to give to America in America? Because it looks to me that everybody thinks, oh, they have money, so we will scoop it. And if you think about dollar and money, it's green paper floating around, and at the same time this process of de-dollarization is happening. So, Alex, what do you think in this, what do you think is happening?
Thank you. I think I'll come back to the points made so we can get all the questions in, if that's all right.
No worries. Tim?
Yeah, thanks, comrades. I think you sort of elucidated that quite well. To look at the reasons why wars take place, we have to see that capitalism, or monopoly capitalism, the highest stage of capitalism, the system is now in irretractable decline. It is not the period of capitalism on the way up. It is the period of capitalism now in decline. Those contradictions are becoming much more acute. The falling rate of profit at home and the sharpening contradictions are leading more and more now towards wars. We're in that period of wars for new markets, the more thorough exploitation of old markets, the grab for more and more natural resources, and the wresting of places, of spheres of influence, of places, for the profitable investment of capital. To look at the social basis for imperialism's wars, the social basis of support, that tends to be a petty bourgeois privileged strata in the working class. A labour aristocracy that benefited, from the super profits of imperialism, which can no longer technically be called super profits, because the period of the average rate of profit of old industrial capitalism before it made that transition to monopoly, that period that Marx spoke of, that has gone. Not even super profits will now suffice. But what is on the order of the day now is the maximum rate of profit. So, Lenin said there's nothing like a good war for restoring the disturbed equilibrium. Because this is the imperialists battling it out for pole position amongst themselves. And the crisis of capitalism has seriously disturbed, the smooth operation of things, and it's only through a war that these things can be restored. But to sort of briefly sum up, because I don't want to monopolise the procedures. I'm trying to think where I was. It is our duty as Marxists, as anti-imperialists, to call for the defeat of our own ruling class and to understand that our interests and theirs are diametrically opposed. They are never on the right side of history. They are never on the right side of the barricades. They are never on the side of the working class. History has demonstrated this graphically. Our interests can never be in line with theirs. And as for the question of war, well, on that point, you can sort of veer towards taking a negative position on the question of war. In speaking of war, we're not anti-war. What we are, we're anti-imperialist war. Is it a progressive war, a war for socialism, a war for independence, or is it a reactionary war, an imperialist war for conquest and plunder? And I'll leave it just on that point. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I think I had Dan, Deezy, then Gabriel, then John.
I was going to say something similar, but he said it much better than I could. So I'll just make a comment, really, about Britain being occupied. I consider Britain to be occupied by the US, and I consider it that it's a stay-behind army, basically, the same way as they used to have in Europe itself when during the Soviet era. And just one point about soldiers. The more soldiers they send to war, it's a double-edged sword, because they're exactly the same people who, once they get disillusioned, can fight. And in every revolution, the soldiers have been a massive element. So, in fact, the more wars they start, the more likely they are. It undermines their own goals at home. And so, after the Second World War, one of the reasons that there was, one of the reasons the working class were able to get some benefits was just due to the fact that all the working class had just come back from war. They were armed and they knew how to fight. So they had to give the super profits out. And so, that's all I've got to say. But, that's just...
Thanks, Dan. If I just quickly jump in before we come to Gabriel and John, or is that a good break to...
Let's take everybody else in.
But I just want to jump in on the idea that Britain is occupied by the US. I mean, it can certainly feel like that or seem like that. There is the special relationship where they have a lot of military bases. They get away with a lot of things, like their CIA officers can run over people in the street and just be sent home. and they control our nuclear missiles, which isn't reassuring. But we can't conflate that with occupational control of our country. Now, the US is the dominant imperialist superpower. Like, wherever it goes, Britain and Western Europe have to follow, have to fall in line eventually. Because they're the declining imperialist powers. They've been declining since after World War II. And America has, for a long time, been the sole imperialist superpower in the world, counterposed to the socialist superpower of the USSR, and now under threat from China as the growing superpower in the world. But that doesn't mean that Britain is occupied or controlled by the US. Our ruling class is a very old ruling class. It's a very crafty ruling class, and it's a very mad ruling class. And quite often you'll find Britain is more dangerous, more warmongering than even the US are sometimes in the operations that Britain plans, in the operations that Britain carries out via the secret services and the special forces. So I think it's important not to overstate that relationship or that control, because Britain is its own imperialist power and it's its own threat that we have to deal with.
I totally agree with what you just said. I kind of see them as like the last resort. So I'm not saying that we're a puppet of America, because Britain is much too sly, and where Britain can, Britain will actually try and get America to do the fighting, and and all that. But the way I see it is those bases are really, they're full of foreign soldiers, right? So in that sense, it's an occupation, right? But also in the sense that, as I said, like a stay-behind army.
Sure. Let's not all devolve into a discussion yet. I get your point, Dan. Thanks. I think you're right in that sense in those points, and you can look at the example of the Finnish Revolution is an interesting one. The failed Finnish Revolution, because they relied on they eventually were going to rely on intervention by German imperialism and almost became part of the German Empire in order to stave off, in order to defeat the Finnish Revolution. They were going to give themselves over to another bourgeois power. So it's definitely the bourgeoisie have obviously shared interests, but they're not the same. But we'll come to Gabriel and then John. Gabriel?
Just on that question, US bases a staging post for attacks on other countries, and that's a position which is obviously untenable and unacceptable to other countries, but also should be unacceptable to the class. I wanted to just say some things about the partial defeat of the anti-imperialist movement, clearly the defeat of the Syrian state. But thinking about the nature of that, and obviously we've got the situation that the axis of resistance is still up there. Right? But I want to look at another slightly different angle. The Arab Spring, planned almost a decade beforehand. It coincides with Bush regime's comments about 7 countries must die or whatever, must fall. But early in the noughties, the USA, with the big tech companies, were teaching people from various Arab countries how to use tech for political means. They were also instigating and preparing street riots and or probably armed insurrection as well in these countries, as well as part of regime regime change, sorry. Clearly in other countries other than the 7 that they wanted to get rid of, the anti-imperialist countries. But as a result of that and the interventions in and destruction of Syria, that was clearly a defeat for Syria, a defeat for the anti-imperialist movement. However, after a decade or so in the Sahel, we've got the national democratic movements taking place in those countries as a result of what happened in Syria. So that takes time sometimes, but the movement can rejig and get up, and there's still progress being made in that part of the world.
Absolutely, Gabriel. Thank you. John?
Oh, hey. I think Dan said a good deal of what I wanted to say, which was I was going to ask Alexander, do you not think you're underplaying a bit the British ruling class? And I guess to link with what I just forgot his name that just said Gabriel just said that. I don't remember the specifics, but, some years ago, there was an incident, I think the nuclear base in Wales or something, and some people had been sentenced to criminal damage for breaking into it or something like that in protest at the American nuclear base. And also I suppose to link with what this lady had said as well, is that the concern against the American nuclear base in Wales, I don't think is largely rooted in people's concern that those forces are going to be turned on Britain. Like, they're being hosted here to be able to maintain, and obviously the British ruling class does have an interest as a lesser imperial power to maintain the imperialist order throughout the world. And I mean, like, Britain hosted American forces during World War II, but they were allies. I mean, and I guess one question that I had earlier on that was, do you see it ever as being really in the cards that American military forces will actually be turned against Britain? Or is it that there is some sovereignty, and British ruling class has an independent existence to it, and it has its own interests, its own independent interests, independent of American, but they tend to mostly be aligned. But that's not to say that if it was to start defying America, that America would come and do an armed invasion or something. It just doesn't really sound right to me, but I don't know. Sorry?
In 1 second they would. In 1
I
second
don't know. I don't know what other people think.
Okay.
Even those against American interests, 1 second they would take the country.
We've had Elon start tweeting crazy things about who knows?
The other question I had was on American control over British nukes and nuclear deterrence, and I never knew about that before. I'd never seen anything about that, but I was just wondering myself in that case, what is the purpose of them? Because America has plenty of nukes of its own, and so why do they exist? And I had another note about the Arab Spring, and I just thought it was worth pointing out these tech trainings and teaching the encryption and empowering people and workers' councils or whatever, if you like. And often it was done by people like Jacob Applebaum, who is quite involved in WikiLeaks, or supporting Hong Kong, the cult. One of his early projects was the cult of the dead cow, and this hacktivism kind of tendency of cyberpunks and against all censorship, right? Helping people circumvent censorship in China and empowering Hong Kong democracy activists. And they tend to be these anarcho-punks that are very misguided, but I think genuinely intentioned, and they have this skill set that they're buried in their technology skills and their knowledge about technology, and they want to put it to some kind of virtuous use because they want to do some good with it. And so censorship seems like something that's repressive and bad. And politics isn't their field, and they just know from common discourse that, oh, that's a repressive, an oppressive dictatorship, an oppressive regime. And so we can just put our skills to use in some way towards undermining that, then that must be good. And so, but the way that people can be misguided by these liberal anarchist kind of ideologies, I thought was worth pointing out.
Thank you, John. I think that's a really good point. Just to quickly say on that last point you made, I think it's entirely right. It's part of the US cultural hegemony. It's part of the soft power. You know, the National Endowment for Democracy, all these things, Radio Free Asia, they don't exist to support, you know, a free press and freedom of speech and happiness everywhere. But like Mark said, you know, everything gets perverted by the bourgeoisie. Everything becomes corrupted by the bourgeoisie. So academia isn't free from it. I was talking to a friend last night. Academia isn't free from it. So I was talking to a friend last night about this issue of, you know, people that want to research things in our society, science and arts and culture and all these things in academia need funding. Where do they get their funding from? The people that have the money. Who has the money? Our class enemies. So they naturally only get funding for things that support the status quo, support the bourgeoisie. And it's the same kind. So it creates a whole atmosphere, a whole intellectual malaise of essentially pro-imperialism within all of those spaces, whether that's like artistic, technological, scientific, all those kind of areas. I mean, the CIA has funded art journals in Europe. It doesn't do that because it loves European art. But yeah, I'll let Alex respond to the other points.
All right, so just to answer John's point about the, was I underplaying the role of the British ruling class? Well, it certainly wasn't intentional, if that's how it came across. I mean, I was emphasising the role of the United States ruling class because they are the undisputed leaders of the imperialist bloc. The only reason why the British, the French, the West Germans, now the Germans, the Italians, Spanish, Portuguese got to do any imperialism after World War II at all was because the US stepped in to save all these ruling classes from total bankruptcy and destruction or potential worker revolution after World War II. So the US made a strategic calculation in 1945 that it would be better for it to reconstruct these governments, these ruling classes, put them back on their feet after they'd been either conquered and destroyed in the war or they were bankrupt like the British were, and to enable them to continue exploiting the bits of the world that they had subjugated prior to that. So all talk of decolonization disappears after about 46, 47, when the Dutch go into Indonesia and try and reconquer that, when the French go into what was once called French Indochina, and the US ends up paying for that war before they ended up fighting it themselves. So the imperialist system after World War II it's somewhat unified behind the US in that none of these powers can exist without the US basically guaranteeing their ability to continue extracting profit from these various different subjugated countries and conquered markets in the world. If the US doesn't want a particular country to continue to be able to exploit a particular area anymore, the plug gets pulled. Just like they pulled the plug on the British ruling class in 1956 over the Suez crisis, because it didn't suit their purposes at the time. They commissioned a run on the pound, and the British were deservedly humiliated and defeated and driven out of Egypt. The British ruling class, what they are engaging in is a strategic calculation of their own, which is that they have calculated after 1945, in fact they started to realise this as soon as early as the 1880s, when it became obvious that the power of the US industrial base was going to far outstrip their own. If you remember, you know, the charming old racist Rudyard Kipling and his poem, The White Man's Burden, do we know, many of us will know what that poem is actually about. It's addressed to America. The White Man's Burden is a poem addressed to America. He, the imperial poet, is asking the Americans to take up the white man's burden, which is, of course, the great burden of profiteering off the backs of other people, where he dressed it up as civilization. But that's a poem written at the end of the 19th century. Why? Because the British ruling class could already see industrially they were declining. And they wanted to continue to be able to exploit their markets, as they considered it, but with a degree of protection coming from the new hegemon, which was going to be the United States. And so the power starts to pass westward from the end of the 19th century. It's accelerated by the war of 14 to 18 and the Great October Revolution and the creation of the Soviet Union. And then but you have this relationship between Britain and the US where Britain depends increasingly upon the US ruling class to be able to continue exploiting different areas of the world. At the same time, the US is continually trying to scalp its allies in the form of Britain, France, Denmark. Trump's going to have Greenland off them, apparently. And it is summed up beautifully by an old Soviet cartoon from about 1951 in the satirical magazine Crocodile, where you've got all the members of NATO sitting on bar stools. They're shaking hands with one hand and using hacksaws to saw each other's stools off at the legs in the other. That's the relationship between these people. On the one hand, allies, and the Europeans can't live without an aggressive US militarist policy designed to subjugate different areas of the world. On the other hand, they're all locked in a rivalry with each other. But the Europeans can't do without the US. So no matter how much the US kicks them in the nuts, they're going to keep going back. Because without them, there is no European imperialism anymore. Look, when the Sahel nations, which one comrade rightly mentioned, I believe it was Comrade Gabriel at the back, when Traoré of Burkina Faso, or Abdurrahman Chiani, or Assimi Goïta of Mali, turned around and said to the French, out, and we're taking your minds off you. So far, the French haven't been able to do anything. Why? Because the US is not backing them up on this, for its own reasons. And if without the US backing the French up, the French have got nothing. Nothing. And so now the Sahel nations will free themselves of the French, and, well, not before time. But to answer the point about the role of the British ruling class, the British ruling class are hoping desperately that the US remains committed to these various wars in order that the British ruling class can swim in their slipstream and hoover up some of the profits to be made when things collapse. So they're like a sort of smaller fish following along with a shark, basically. So this is why the British are even more militant and even more aggressive about the Ukraine war than even the US itself is. Because the US itself is in a long-term crisis, but it still sits on a bigger industrial base than all of Europe. It still sits on a gigantic amount of capital that its ruling class has accumulated over the past 75 years, since the end of World War II. It still sits on all the advantages that it has gathered into itself by being the premier imperialist power. Now, if the US loses in Ukraine, it will be a defeat, and it will be a very damaging one, but it won't be fatal. For the Europeans, especially Germany, especially France, especially Britain, who were gambling upon not only winning in Ukraine, but destabilizing Russia to the point where it could be handed over to a new Yeltsin and be opened up for looting, they were dependent upon that for the revival of the systems here, which have been stagnating for decades. So the row between the US and the Europeans and the British now is that an element in the US ruling class has decided this Ukraine thing's done. We're not going to get it. The Russians have got it. We're not going to risk going toe-to-toe with the Russians because we can't do it. They can't do it on a military level. They don't have the men. The US industrial base, though bigger than the European one, can't compete with the level of production that the Russians can manage. So they've decided we're going to go elsewhere. It's going to take a big row, though, because the Europeans are desperate for this to continue. And so this is the relationship. This is the relationship between the US and the Europeans. One of dependency on the one hand, resentment, a great deal of resentment that they have to rely on the US, but also from the US's point of view, continually trying to betray its allies and take their businesses off them. This is what loyalty under capitalism looks like, comrades. No solidarity here. Now, to answer the point also, I believe, John, you asked the question about what a stay-behind army is. Stay-behind army is things like Operation Gladio, which you may have heard of, which is the secret armies that were created by the US and the British intelligence services in collaboration with the remains of the Italian and the German fascist military intelligence operations at the end of World War II. This was meant to be a series of guerrilla armies and special operations forces that were supposedly there to counteract a Soviet invasion. We know now, thanks to declassified files, there was never any chance of a Soviet invasion. What they were there to do was to act as basically enforcer units against the domestic communist parties. That's what they were there to do. And we know it exists because the former Italian Prime Minister, Giulio Andreotti, went on before the Italian Parliament in the early 90s and actually admitted that this existed. And in Italy, it was organized partly through NATO intelligence operations, partly through the Italian mafia, partly through what was called the P2 Masonic Lodge. That was involved as well. It's where a lot of these guys hung out together. That's not a conspiracy. That's all on the record and admitted to. And the British intelligence service is one of the primary movers through the continent-wide Gladio operations. It's based on a lot of British anti-insurgency, anti-colonial liberation struggles that the British, under people like Frank Kitson, ran in the colonies in like the 40s, 50s, 60s. It's based on a lot of the British experience in the occupied 6 counties of Ireland as well. So that's what that refers to, basically. Shall I answer some of the other points, Dan?
Go for it.
Okay. So the point about the Arab Spring and the colour revolution training schools, I mean, that's absolutely accurate. I mean, I used to work in the NGO world many years ago. If you ask me privately, I might even tell you for which organisation. But the point about it is, and it's again, one of the comrades made this point, a lot of people get sucked into this world with a naive belief that they're making the world a better place. That's what you're told by the propaganda over and over again. And because you don't understand the nature of imperialism, you think you're just teaching a bunch of Armenians, for instance, how to engage in social media exposure of government corruption. Whereas what you're actually doing is you're training intelligence assets. That's what you're doing. You're training people to act on the ground as an information warfare wing of the American and British intelligence operations, run destabilization campaigns. Now, the British and the US and the French and others are very good at identifying certain weak points to push on as certain of these countries. It's why that they were ready to go when the revolts against the Tunisian leader Ben Ali and against Mubarak broke out. They had the networks in place, they had the people in place ready to pick that up and run with it. It's not that all of the causes that triggered those revolts were just invented. It's that what happened was in those countries, the people with the primary powerful networks in place were the imperialists. They were ready to go with it, which is why those things all ended up going the way they did. It's why Egypt went in a circle from a dictatorship round back to a dictatorship again, because that is the way in which imperialism wanted it to go. Now you have a military dictator who's even worse and even more corrupt than the last guy. Now to go back to a question about I think I've already talked about the point about what the nature of the US presence here, but to answer the point about whether the US would turn its forces on a revolt in Britain, if the British ruling class failed, they would. They'd rely on the British ruling class first to crush it. But if there was a socialist revolution in this country, all of the imperialist powers would absolutely have an interest in crushing it. And let's not just limit it to the US. The French should have a go as well. They all would, in a heartbeat. Because it is the same reason they intervened in Russia with at least, 17 different armies in about 3 years? Because they can't allow a socialist example to exist anywhere. They're still besieging. Yeah, they're still besieging Cuba, for God's sake, after like 60 plus years. And they're not exactly threatening to invade Florida. It's because they cannot allow even the smallest example to exist. And so, yeah, don't make any mistake. All of the imperialist powers, and our own beloved ruling class, would carpet bomb our own cities in a heartbeat if they thought they could get away with it.
On the British Isles?
The purpose of the bases is twofold. Firstly, to project power into places like the West Asia, places like Ukraine. The other part of it is to guarantee good behaviour here and and enable them to bring in supplies, bring in people, and dominate the space here. They always serve more than one purpose, comrade, is my point. And yeah, all serves the same point. Now, to go back to Tim's point, I wanted to just pick up on what decline of imperialism means. Decline of imperialism is not overnight. It doesn't fall apart overnight. Like if you look historically, even before the capitalist period, if you look at like the long decline of the Western and the Eastern Roman Empire, that took hundreds and hundreds of years because it was so far ahead of its competitors, which eventually caught up with it and overwhelmed it. But the British imperialists were light years ahead of their competitors for an awfully long time, which is why the decline of British imperialism, having accumulated so much capital from looting over a quarter of the globe for so long, has taken the best part of over a century. But the decline is there and it is obvious. And just as people say, well, the US is declining, yes, it doesn't happen overnight. It happens over a number of years as its ability to exert its power in the world slowly wanes and competitors rise who can actually match it militarily and economically, industrially and scientifically, which is what the Chinese are doing. They are surpassing them industrially and surpassing them scientifically to the point where the US is getting seriously worried that it's losing all of its competitive edges. So decline is not an overnight thing, nor is it a straight line process. There's various different zigzags that history does take. Milovana raised the point about the Gulf states paying for the terrorist programs, and yes, they do, and you're right, their resources are not unlimited. It very much depends upon, of course, the price of oil, the price of gas, and their ability to generate money through that. Now, and that won't last forever, by no means, and these countries are still very dependent for their security apparatuses on the imperialist powers. For all their attempts to play nice with the Russians and the Chinese, these are still very much in the orbit of the US and the British. Now, the 600 billion that Trump was boasting about the other day, saying to Mohammed bin Salman, well, why don't you round it up to $1 trillion, as if this was like a fiver he found on the back of a sofa. The 600 billion is essentially, this is the Saudi ruling elite playing the same games that it always does when it wants to play its balancing act. On the one hand, the Saudis will sign deals with the Russians and the Chinese. On the other hand, they'll say to Trump, because they know how transactional Trump's mind is, and they'll say, well, Mr. President, we value the US relationship so much, we'll invest 600 billion in there. Now, whether that actually happens or not is another question. But it is true that the Saudis have been in this symbiotic relationship with the US for many, many decades now, at least since the early 1970s, where the US took over the primary role of managing the Saudi regime from the British. And the Saudi regime, in return for having its security guaranteed by the US and itself guaranteed in power by the US, puts a ton of money into the US stock market and the British stock market as well, to say thank you basically every year. And that is essentially tribute, because the Saudi regime is actually incredibly brittle. It is incredibly weak. It is based upon like a small layer, well, it's quite a large number, but it's still a small layer of the population dominating everything. And it's based on handing out, it gains consent by handing out some of the proceeds from its oil money to large segments of the population. If any of that gets disturbed, you start to see some real problems there. There were serious revolts in Saudi Arabia at the end of the 1970s, which are sort of written off now as fundamentalist revolts. A lot of these were revolts of the poor, suppressed Shia population in the neglected areas of the country. And that is a neglected part of history. And it shows that the Saudi regime is a lot less stable than it appears to be. And any disturbance in the oil price or internal dissent, which the regime is not equipped to handle, could see that country go into a near-revolutionary situation. That's why they sent their army in to try and crush Yemen and failed, because they were afraid of the consequences of what would happen if Yemen liberated itself from foreign domination. And so these regimes are a lot more brittle and they are much more subject to the potential revolt of the masses than they first appear to be. And I will just bring my comments on this to a conclusion, comrades, by saying that if you have enjoyed the discussion today, and I hope you have found it informative, I would appeal to you, if you're not a member or supporter of the party already, to please consider signing up. You can talk to any of the comrades here afterwards about that. I would say that what we are trying to do is to, as we said at the beginning when talking about Comrade Harpal and his legacy, we are trying to rebuild the true legacy of of communist revolutionary practice in this country. We are trying to build a communist party that is genuinely rooted in the working class. We are the only party that is prepared to be honest with the class about the tasks that are ahead of us. And so if you want to get involved in that process of building and rebuilding, I would urge you to sign up as a supporter and help us in this fight ahead of us, because it will be an arduous one. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you very much, comrades. And as Alex said, get involved with the party if you can. We're the only sincerely anti-imperialist working class party in the UK, in Britain, and we need your help, your activity, your involvement, but also your money. We can't be shy about asking for that. We're trying to buy Greenland, but there's some other bidders, and we're not sure we're going to get it.
Settle for the Isle of Skye.
We're trying to buy Greenland, but there's some other bidders, and we're not sure if we'll get it. So please join up as a supporter online if you're not already. Contribute something to the party. It helps us publish materials, print the newspapers, keep publishing stuff online, and bring you Marx-Leninist news analysis and for us to take it out to the class as well. So please consider doing that. And I just want to say one thing at the risk of everyone who thought they could leave just now. At the risk of that, the imperialists have not really won anything since World War II. Not completely. They were kicked out of Vietnam. They couldn't crush Korea. They've been, although the Soviet Union was destroyed, they've been unable to completely subjugate Russia. And they've balkanized and taken over some of Eastern Europe. But they've never won an absolute victory, and they can't. And they will never win a victory against peoples that are determined to stand up for themselves, for their rights, for their freedom from imperialist oppression. And we can never be defeated as long as we join in with those masses that have the will to win, the desire to win, because they're fighting for their people, they're fighting for their homelands, they're fighting for their right to exist, and they're fighting for each other, and they're fighting for us. So do not be despondent about what happened in Syria. Take heart from the fact that this struggle is much longer, much bigger, and involves the working class across the world. And we will win. We will be victorious eventually.